The clink of fine crystal was the only music she knew these days. It was a sharp, hollow sound, nothing like the rich, singing tones she used to pull from another kind of keyboard. Now, her world was made of polished silver trays, half-eaten canapes, and the low, comfortable hum of money. She moved through the Grand Celeste's grand ballroom like a shadow in a black dress and a stiff white apron. Her eyes were down, watching the swirl of gowns and the shine of expensive shoes, not making contact with anyone. That was the rule. Be helpful, be silent, be invisible. The guests were here to see each other, to be seen, to make deals with handshakes and smiles. She was just part of the scenery, like the massive flower arrangements or the gilt on the walls. Her hands were careful as she lifted a flute of champagne, its bubbles nearly gone, from a marble-top table. They were good hands with long fingers, strong too. You could see a few faint calluses if you looked close, not from this work, but from something else, something old. She tucked a stray piece of dark hair behind her ear, a nervous habit she couldn't break, and let her gaze sweep the room just for a second. It was a beautiful cage. Chandeliers dripped light from the ceiling, making the women's jewels sparkle. A string quartet played in the corner, something sweet and forgettable, the notes blending into the chatter. She knew the piece. She could have played it in her sleep at 15. The thought was like a tiny, familiar pinch under her ribs. She pushed it away. That life was gone. That girl was gone. Tonight's party was special, even for the Celeste. It was for the man who owned the hotel, a man named Mr. Thorne. He was standing near the front, holding court. A tall man with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He laughed at something a companion said, but the laugh didn't reach those eyes. They were busy scanning, calculating, owning everything they saw. She'd served him once before, in a private dining room. He'd asked for a specific mineral water, in a specific glass, at a specific temperature. He hadn't looked at her face, only at her hands as they placed the glass down. She'd felt like a machine he was testing. The quartet finished their piece with a soft, fading note. There was a smattering of polite applause, more like the rustle of leaves. A man's voice, loud and a little slurred from drink, cut through the murmur. Lovely, darling, lovely. But doesn't it make you sleepy? Where's the fire? Where's the passion? A few people chuckled. The leader of the quartet gave a tight smile. Mr. Thorne's sharp eyes stopped their scanning. They landed on the complainer, then drifted away, thoughtful. They moved across the room, over the heads of his important guests, past the sparkling lights. And then, they stopped. They stopped on her. She was frozen, an empty tray held against her stomach like a shield. She knew that look. It was the look of a man who has seen a tool he'd forgotten he owned. His voice, cool and clear, didn't need to shout. The room quieted for him anyway. You, there, the quiet one with the tray. Every head in her vicinity turned. Heat flooded her cheeks, a painful blush that felt like a spotlight. She wanted to sink into the ornate carpet, the staff files. Mr. Thorne continued, speaking to the room as much as to her. They are very thorough. I make it a point to know the potential of my investments, even the small ones. He took a slow sip of his drink, letting the silence grow heavy. Your file says you used to play the piano. The words hung in the air. Used to play. They felt like an accusation. A few guests raised their eyebrows. Some smiled, curious. Others looked mildly annoyed at the interruption of their conversations. That grand piano on the stage isn't just for show, Mr. Thorne said, nodding toward the beautiful, glossy instrument that stood silent on a low platform. It's meant to be played, to entertain my guests. He put his glass down on a table with a final click. So entertain us. It wasn't a request. It was an order. The same tone he'd probably used to tell her to fetch that specific glass of water. This was worse. This was a public command, a twist of the knife. He was pulling the invisible server into the light, not to honor her, but to see if the old story in her file was true, to make her a party trick, a bit of unexpected drama for his bored friends. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped rhythm. 1,000 thoughts crashed together. She could refuse, mutter an apology, and flee. That would mean her job, for sure. She could try to play something simple, something meek, and slink away. That would satisfy his command and confirm his low opinion. She looked at the piano. It had been so long, a lifetime. The world she'd lost, the roaring applause, the bright stage lights, the feeling of the keys alive under her fingers. It all rushed back in a wave of such intense hurt that it stole her breath. That world ended in whispers and broken trust, in a manager who vanished with more than just money. leaving her name muddied and her spirit shattered. She'd run here, to this job where no one knew her, where she could just be a pair of hands. But this man, with his cold eyes and his entitled command, had just dragged that buried girl back into the room, and something in her, something that had been sleeping in the dark, curled up in shame, suddenly woke up. It wasn't gratitude, it wasn't fear, it was a slow, burning anger. It started deep in her stomach, a hot coal, and began to spread. He wanted to see the piano girl from the file. He wanted a performance. Very well. The blush faded from her cheeks, replaced by a pale, calm stillness. The chattering crowd, the expectant and mocking faces, the glittering room, it all seemed to fade into a blur. The only clear things were the path to the piano and the man who had ordered her to walk it. Without a word, she bent and carefully, precisely, set her silver tray down on a small, empty table. The clink it made was different this time. It was a period, a full stop. She straightened her spine. The hunched, make myself small posture of the server fell away like a discarded coat. Then she began to walk, not quickly, not nervously, but with a slow, deliberate pace that was completely foreign to this room of rushed socializing. She didn't look at the guests as she passed them. Her gaze was fixed ahead, on the polished blackwood of the piano. Her hands, which had been clutching a tray minutes before, hung loosely at her sides, then flexed once. As if remembering, the murmur of the crowd returned, lower now, buzzing with confusion and anticipation. Who was this? The meek server was gone. In her place was a woman walking with a quiet, terrifying focus. She reached the 3 shallow steps to the platform and climbed them. She stood for a moment beside the piano bench, her back to the room, her head bowed down. Then she sat. She adjusted the bench, pulling it closer. Then a little further back, a series of small, practiced movements. She placed her hands in her lap, fingers loosely curled. She took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling. The room was utterly silent now. The joke was over. This was something else. She looked at her hands in her lap. These were the hands that had lifted countless trays, scrubbed countless glasses. They were also the hands that had once made critics weep in darkened concert halls. They were both things. And tonight, in this awful, beautiful room, they would have to choose. She lifted them. They hovered for a second over the ivory keys, which seemed to glow in the soft light. The air was thick, waiting. And then, she began to play. The first note was not what anyone expected. It was not loud, not a dramatic crash to grab their attention. It was a single, clear, lonely sound. It hung in the quiet of the ballroom, pure and sad, like a single drop of water falling into a still pond. Then another note followed, and another, weaving together into a slow, haunting melody. It was Chopin, the Nocturne in C-sharp minor. If you knew music, you knew this piece was not fireworks. It was a heartache, put into sound. Her head was bent slightly over the keys. Her eyes were open, but they weren't seeing the black and white in front of her. They were seeing something else. Maybe a small practice room with a scratched-up piano, the sun coming through a dusty window. Maybe the proud, hopeful face of her first teacher, a kind woman with ink-stained fingers. Maybe the crushing silence of an empty apartment after everything fell apart. The music she played was full of that memory. It was beautiful, but it was a beauty that hurt. It was the sound of something precious, lost. The crowd was frozen. The man who had complained about the lack of passion stood with his mouth slightly open, his drink forgotten. The polite, social smiles were gone from every face. This was not background music. This was a story, and against their will, they were all listening. Mr. Thorne had not moved from his spot. His sharp eyes were narrowed, watching her back, watching the slight sway of her shoulders as she played. This was not the party trick he had ordered. This was something real, and he was trying to figure out if it was a problem or an opportunity. The sad, singing melody flowed on. Her fingers, those same fingers that had just been clearing his table, moved with a grace that seemed impossible for a server. They barely seemed to press the keys. They touched them, and the sound wept out into the room. An older woman near the front felt a tear escape and rolled down her powdered cheek. She didn't wipe it away. A man in a military-style jacket closed his eyes, transported by the simple, devastating emotion of it. She was playing for herself. For the first time in years, she was not hiding. The music was a shield and a confession all at once. In those few minutes, the uniform didn't exist. The Grand Celeste didn't exist. There was only the truth of the notes, and the girl who had once lived for them. But the story of the Nocturne is one of longing, not of anger. And the anger was still there, that hot coal in her stomach waiting. The final section of the piece came, a series of delicate, running notes that climbed higher and higher, like someone trying to reach for a fading dream. Before falling back down in a sigh of resignation, she played the last, soft chord. It faded into the silence. There was a moment of perfect stillness. Then, a wave of relieved, appreciative applause started to rise from the crowd. It was the kind of applause you give to a surprisingly good performance. It said, "Well done. How lovely." Now, back to the party. People began to shift their weight, to turn to their neighbors with impressed smiles. The spell was breaking. The servant had done her unexpected trick, and now the normal evening could resume. She heard it. The sound of that polite clapping was like a key turning in a lock inside her. It was the sound of being patted on the head, the sound of being dismissed. Asterisk used to play, asterisk the words echoed in her head. This man, this room. They had taken her deepest private loss and made it a moment of casual entertainment. And now they thought it was over. Her hands, which had rested softly on the keys after the final note, tensed. The grateful, mournful girl was shoved back into the shadows. Someone else sat up on the bench. Her back straightened. She took a sharp, deep breath that lifted her shoulders, and then she attacked. Her left hand slammed down on a low, rumbling chord that shook the air in the room. It wasn't a musical chord. It was a declaration of war. Before the echo of the first chord had died, her right hand flew across the keys in a wild, rushing cascade of notes. The gentle Chopin was gone, vaporized. This was Franz Liszt. This was his Mephisto waltz, and it was fire. The crowd jumped as one. The polite applause died instantly, choked off. This was not music to clap along to. This was music to survive. Her entire body came alive. No more sad stillness. Now, she was a storm. Her shoulders rocked with the force of her playing. Her head lifted, her eyes blazing at the music rack in front of her. Though she wasn't reading a thing, she knew this devil's dance by heart. The piece was wild, technically insane, full of grinning mischief and roaring fury. It was the perfect voice for everything she couldn't say. The fast sections were a blur, notes tumbling over each other like a rock slide. Her fingers weren't just touching the keys now. They were striking them, punching them, flying from one end of the keyboard to the other in leaps that seemed impossible. The sound was huge. It filled every corner of the opulent room, shaking the champagne in the glasses. It was violent, and beautiful, and utterly free. This was the passion the drunk guest had whined for. But this wasn't for him. This was her scream. This was the sound of every ignored day, every silent order, every time she had to bite her tongue. This was the sound of a talent that had been locked in a closet, now breaking the door off its hinges. She played the mocking, laughing phrases of the piece with a savage smile twisting her own lips. She played the thunderous, angry passages with a strength that came from her very core. People didn't know where to look. They stared at her hands, a frantic blur of motion. They stared at her face, transformed from pale calm into fierce, focused intensity. The military man was leaning forward, elbows on his knees, his face alight with shock and admiration. The older woman who had cried was now gripping her companion's arm, her knuckles white. Mr. Thorne had taken a step forward. All calculation was gone from his face, replaced by something like raw shock. He was not seeing a servant anymore. He was seeing a force of nature he had foolishly unleashed. The music built and built, a whirlwind of sound. It was chaotic, but she controlled every single note of the chaos. This was the proof. This was what used to play really meant. It wasn't a hobby. It was who she was. The piano was not an instrument under her hands. It was an extension of her own anger and her soul. She played a series of octaves so fast and so loud they sounded like cannon fire. A few people actually flinched. She was breathing hard now, sweat beading at her temple. The physical effort was immense. This was a marathon run at a sprinter's pace. But she didn't slow down. She poured every last bit of feeling into it: the betrayal of her old manager, the shame of her fall, the loneliness of this new life, and the pure, burning injustice of this very moment. It all went into the music. The piece raced towards its end, a final, mad gallop. The rhythm was pounding, irresistible. And then, with the last, furious sprint up the keyboard, she landed onto final, crashing chords. Asterisk asterisk bang, bang, asterisk asterisk. The sound was like the slams of a giant's fist. It was not a pretty ending. It was a brutal, shocking stop. Silence. But this silence was different from the one after the Chopin. That had been a respectful, sad silence. This was a silence punched into existence. It was stunned, deafened. The air itself felt charged, vibrating. Her hands stayed on the keys, pressing them down into the wood, as if holding the ghost of the sound inside the piano. Her head was bowed, her hair falling around her face. Her shoulders rose and fell with her ragged breaths. The only sound in the vast room was the sound of her trying to get air back into her lungs. No one moved. No one clapped. No one even whispered. They were all just trying to understand what had just happened to them. The elegant gala was gone. In its place was the aftermath of an earthquake. The silence was a physical thing. It was heavy, like a thick blanket thrown over the entire ballroom. It was the silence of a world that had just been shattered by sound and was now trying to remember what normal felt like. At the piano, the woman lifted her hands from the keys. The movement was slow, as if they were heavy. She held them in the air for a second, her fingers still curled in the shape of the last crushing chords. They trembled slightly, but not from fear, from the pure, raw energy that had just ripped through them. She lowered her hands into her lap and sat perfectly still. Her head remained bowed. It wasn't a bow of submission. It was the posture of someone utterly spent. It was the quiet after the explosion. She just needed a moment, one single moment, to be alone inside herself before she had to face the world outside. That world was beginning to wake up. A gasp came from the back of the room. It was a short, sharp intake of breath that seemed to break the spell. Then came a low, collective murmur, like the sound of the ocean heard from far away. It was a murmur of pure shock. A chair scraped loudly on the marble floor as a man in a tuxedo stood up. He didn't know why he stood. His body just did it. He started clapping. Not a polite clap. A slow, loud, deliberate clap that cut through the murmur. Asterisk clap, clap, clap asterisk. It was like a match struck in a dark room. Another person stood and joined in. Then another. And then it wasn't a wave, it was a flood. The entire room erupted. People were on their feet, their faces alight with a kind of wild excitement. This wasn't the gentle applause for the Chopin. This was a roaring, whistling, shouting ovation. They weren't just clapping for music. They were clapping for the shock, for the spectacle, for the sheer, unbelievable nerve of it. They had been bored, and she had set the room on fire. Incredible, shouted one man, his voice hoarse. Brava, brava, cried a woman, her hands clasped under her chin. The noise was overwhelming. It crashed over the stage where she sat. She finally lifted her head. The fierce, burning look in her eyes from moments before was gone. Now, she just looked, empty and tired, deeply, bone-achingly tired. She looked out at the sea of standing, cheering people. Their faces were a blur of open mouths and shining eyes. They looked like they wanted to devour her, to claim this moment for themselves. She didn't smile. She didn't bow. She just looked at them, her expression unreadable. The uniform she wore, the simple black dress and white apron, looked absurd now. It was a costume from a play that was over. She was something else entirely. She pushed the piano bench back. It made a dull screech on the wooden stage. The sound was ugly and real. She stood up. Her legs felt a little unsteady, like she'd just stepped off a speeding train. She smoothed the front of her apron, a simple, automatic gesture. Then she turned her back on the grand piano, on the instrument that had just been her weapon and her voice. She walked to the edge of the small platform. The crowd was still roaring, but the sound seemed to fade a little, as if she was walking out of a storm. Her eyes were down again, but this time it wasn't from meekness. It was from focus. She had one job left, to get out of this room. She descended the 3 steps. The moment her feet touched the main ballroom floor, people surged toward her, not to touch her, but to be near her, to speak at her. My dear, that was extraordinary. Where did you study? Gushed a woman with diamonds in her ears. Who is your agent? I must speak with them, said a man, thrusting a business card toward her hand. She didn't answer. She didn't take the card. She moved through them as she had moved through them all night, like a shadow, slipping through gaps. Her body turned slightly to avoid contact, but she was no longer invisible. They were all trying to see her. They were creating the gaps for her, parting slightly in her path, their eyes wide with new curiosity. Her own goal was clear. The silver tray. It was still sitting on that small, empty table where she had left it, a little island of her old life in this new, chaotic sea. She made a straight line for it. Halfway there, a figure stepped directly into her path. Mr. Thorne. He was not smiling. His sharp eyes were wide, all their usual cool calculation replaced by something urgent and intense. He looked at her as if he was seeing her for the very first time, which, in a way, he was. The servant was gone. In front of him stood the artist he had accidentally uncovered. "Wait," he said. His voice was lower, trying to cut through the noise around them. He had to speak up. "Just wait a moment," she stopped. She had to. He was blocking her way. She looked up at him, her face calm, but her eyes held a warning. They were the eyes of someone who had nothing left to lose. "That," Mr. Thorne said, gesturing vaguely toward the piano, "was not in your file." She said nothing. She just waited. "You have a gift," he continued, the words tumbling out. He was a man used to making deals, and he could see the deal of a lifetime slipping away. "A serious gift. We should talk, tonight, my private office. We can discuss a different arrangement, a concert, here, at the Celeste. We could announce it next week." He was offering her everything, a stage, an audience, her name in lights. It was the dream, handed to her by the very man who had humiliated her minutes before. She looked at him for a long moment. She saw the hunger in his eyes. It wasn't for music, it was for possession. He wanted to own this discovery. He wanted to be the man who found the piano genius in his own hotel. She was no longer a servant. She was a new, shiny asset. The noise of the crowd was a distant buzz. In this small space between them, it was quiet. She could smell his expensive cologne. She thought about it. She thought about saying yes. She thought about the simple, brutal relief it would bring. No more trays. No more invisible nights. A way back. A path opened by the very fire that had burned her before. But the taste in her mouth was still bitter. The memory of his command entertain us to fresh. It was not an invitation. It was an order. And everything he was offering now was just another kind of order. He would own her story. He would wrap it in the brand of the Grand Celeste. She would be his talented servant in a nicer dress. She looked past his shoulder, at the silver tray on the table. It was just a tray, but it represented a choice. A clean break. A life where she answered to no one's command but her own, even if it was harder. Even if it meant nothing. She looked back at him. "My shift," she said, her voice quiet but perfectly clear in the space between them, "has ended, sir." Then she stepped around him. She didn't push him. She just moved, as if he was a piece of furniture in her path. He was so stunned he actually took a half step back. She reached the table. She picked up the tray. It felt familiar in her hands, solid, real. She turned and, holding it in front of her like a shield, she walked toward the service doors at the back of the ballroom. The crowd was still cheering, but now they were cheering for her back. A few people called out, "Encore!" But the word sounded silly, pathetic. What she had done could not be repeated. It was a what-time event, a lightning strike. She pushed through the heavy, sound-muffling door marked "Staff Only." The roar of the ballroom vanished, replaced by the familiar, quiet hum of the hotel's inner workings. The corridor was plain, lit by fluorescent lights. It smelled of cleaning supplies and stale coffee. A young busboy was there, leaning against the wall, his eyes wide. He had heard the music, the applause, through the door. He stared at her as if she was a ghost. She walked past him without a word, down the corridor toward the staff locker room. Her footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor. The only sound, inside the locker room, it was empty. She went to her small locker, number 47. She set the silver tray down on a bench. She fumbled with the small lock, her fingers still feeling strange, then opened the door. Inside was a worn-out coat, a scarf, a small purse. A life, her life. She took off the white apron. She unclipped it, folded it neatly, and placed it on the shelf in the locker. She took off the little black name tag that pinned to her dress. She looked at it for a second, then put it on top of the apron. She slipped her coat on. It was old and a little thin, but it was hers. She picked up her purse. She took one last look into the locker, at the uniform, at the name tag, at the silver tray sitting on the bench. Then she closed the locker door. It clicked shut with a final sound. She didn't look back. She walked out of the locker room, out through the staff entrance into the cool night air of the alley behind the Grand Celeste. The sounds of the city greeted her: cars, distant sirens, the rustle of the wind. Real sounds. She stood there for a moment, breathing it in. The air was cold and clean. She could still feel the vibration of the piano in her arms, a phantom echo. She had walked into the ballroom a servant. She had walked out as something else. What that was, she didn't quite know yet. But for the first time in a very, very long time, the next move was hers alone to make. She started walking, leaving the glittering cage behind her, stepping into the noisy, uncertain, free night. The cold night air didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. It was sharp in her lungs, washing away the last of the ballroom's perfumed, heated air. She walked quickly, her old coat pulled tight, the sounds of the city growing louder as she moved away from the hotel's insulated silence. Her mind was blank, not empty, but overloaded. It was like a radio tuned to too many stations at once, a static roar of leftover sound. The echo of the piano, the memory of hundreds of staring faces, the feel of the keys, the cold shock in Mr. Thorne's eyes. She just walked, letting her feet carry her without direction. The physical act of moving helped settle the storm inside. She crossed into a small, quiet park, a patch of darkness dotted with the soft glow of old street lamps. The noise of the traffic faded to a hum. She found an empty bench, the wood cold and damp, and sat down. She let her head fall into her hands, her fingers pushing into her hair. Only now, alone, did the full force of what she had done hit her. It wasn't pride. It wasn't regret. It was a deep, trembling exhaustion, mixed with a strange, electric feeling under her skin. She had broken something. A wall. She wasn't sure what would come flooding through the crack. She sat there for a long time, just breathing. The world was very quiet. Back at the Grand Celeste, the world was anything but quiet. The gala was over, but the party had just moved to the lobby bar and the private conversations. The story was spreading, morphing with each telling. The tale of the server genius, the Cinderella of the concert grand, was too delicious not to share. People pulled out their phones, not to call, but to record shaky, breathless messages to friends who weren't there. You will not believe what just happened. A well-dressed woman with a severe haircut was not talking to friends. She was typing with fierce concentration on her phone, her thumbs flying. She was an arts columnist for a major newspaper, and she had been at the gala out of duty, expecting a boring evening. She had gotten the story of the year. Her post was not just gossip. It was a vivid, eyewitness account. She described the command, the haunting Chopin, and then the volcanic, technically staggering eruption of Liszt. She ended with a question that was also a headline. Who is the pianist we humiliated into playing? And why isn't she on the world stages? She hit send. The digital ripple began. Meanwhile, in a corner of the now empty ballroom, two men were talking. One was the man in the military-style jacket who had closed his eyes during the Chopin. The other was an older gentleman with kind eyes and unruly white hair, who had been sitting quietly at the back all night. The military man was agitated, gesturing with his glass. Did you hear the control in those octaves, Anton? The sheer power? That wasn't just talent. That was a world-class technique buried. It's a crime. The older man, Anton, nodded slowly. He was a retired conductor, a man whose opinion still carried immense weight in musical circles. He had come to the gala as a favor to an old friend, feeling out of place and weary. He had been about to leave when the command was given. He had stayed, and what he witnessed had shaken the weariness from his bones. It was more than technique, Anton said, his voice soft but certain. It was the story. You heard it. The first piece was a funeral. The second was a war. She wasn't playing notes. She was playing her biography. He looked toward the now dark stage. We need to find her. Thorne knows who she is, the military man said, scoffing. He'll lock her into some awful hotel residency deal before sunrise. Anton shook his head, a small, knowing smile on his face. Did you see her face when she walked away from him? That was not a woman signing a contract. That was a woman leaving a prison. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a small, elegant notebook and a pen. We find her another way. Down in the staff areas, the buzz was of a different kind. The news had shot through the kitchens and laundry rooms like a current. Whispers flew over steaming pots and between rows of hanging uniforms. Did you hear about Elena from Banquets? They say Mr. Thorne made her play and she brought the house down. Is she fired? Is she famous? A young dishwasher, the one who had seen her walk into the corridor, was the closest thing to a celebrity. He reenacted her walk for a captivated audience of porters. She just walked right past, man, like she was in a trance, like a queen. And then the boss tried to stop her and she just went around him, cool as ice. The manager of hotel services, a nervous man with a permanently furrowed brow, was in a panic. He had Mr. Thorne's personal assistant on the line, demanding the employee file for the pianist server immediately. His hands shook as he pulled it from the cabinet. It was thin. It contained her application, her tax forms, a copy of her ID, and a single, vague reference from a cafe that had since closed. There was nothing about music. The address listed was a small apartment in a modest, distant neighborhood. He took a picture of it with his phone and sent it, his stomach churning. He had no idea if he was facilitating a promotion or a termination out in the night. On her park bench, she finally stood up. The cold had seeped into her bones, and it felt good. It felt real. She knew where she was going. She walked to a subway station, descended into the warm, gritty air below the city, and caught a nearly empty train. The journey was a blur of flashing lights and tunnels. She got off at her stop and walked the familiar 5 blocks to her apartment building. It was an old, plain brick building with a flickering light over the door. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs, her legs finally feeling the ache of the long night. At her door, she paused. For a moment, it felt like she was about to enter the life of the person she had been just a few hours ago. A person who would wake up, put on the uniform, and go back to the Celeste. She turned the key and went inside. It was a small place, neat but shabby. The main room held a sofa, a small table, and in the corner, covered by a faded quilt, was an upright piano. It was old, the wood scratched, some of the keys chipped. It was nothing like the glorious instrument at the hotel, but it was hers. She had bought it with the last of her savings when she took the hotel job. A private, stubborn act of defiance against the life she was living. She walked over to it and pulled the quilt off. It fell to the floor in a heap. She sat on the worn stool. She didn't play. She just rested her fingers on the keys. They felt familiar, like the hand of an old friend. This was where she had grieved, where she had practiced the Chopin on nights when the loneliness was too much, where she had kept the fire banked, just barely alive. Her phone, an old model with a cracked screen, buzzed in her purse on the table. Then it buzzed again, and again she ignored it. She knew what it was. The world was knocking. Mr. Thorne's people, maybe the press, curiosity seekers. She felt a tight knot of anxiety form in her chest. This was what she had run from before: the noise, the demands, the feeling of being owned. She got up and made a cup of tea, the simple ritual calming her. The phone kept buzzing, a persistent, angry insect on the table. She finished her tea and washed the cup. The buzzing stopped, then started again almost immediately. She knew she couldn't ignore it forever. With a deep breath, she walked over and picked it up. The screen showed 14 missed calls from unknown numbers and 5 text messages. The first few were from numbers she didn't recognize. One was from a fellow server, just saying, "Oh my God." The last text was from the hotel's head of human resources. It was formal and brief. "Please contact the office at your earliest convenience tomorrow regarding your position." She put the phone down. She didn't feel fired, she felt released. She walked back to the piano. This time, she played. Not Liszt, not Chopin. Something simple. A scale, slowly, listening to the tone of each note, the slight imperfections of her own instrument. Then a simple melody, something from childhood. It was just music now. Not a weapon, not a scream, just sound. As she played, her eyes drifted to the window. The sky was beginning to lighten from black to a deep, soft blue. Dawn was coming. She had walked out of one room. Now, she had to decide what door to open next. The buzz of the phone was the world offering her one path back, a path paved with contracts and headlines and Mr. Thorne's hungry eyes. But the quiet in her small apartment, the feel of her own piano keys, offered another. It was harder. It was unknown. It was hers. She stopped playing. The final note hung in the quiet room. She sat in the growing light, not as a server, not as a vanished prodigy, but as a woman in the eye of her own storm, waiting to see which way the wind would blow, and deciding if she would follow it or walk her own way into the dawn. The dawnlight turned from deep blue to a pale gray, washing the small apartment in a cool, quiet glow. She sat at her old piano until the last echo of her simple melody had faded completely into the silence. The buzzing phone on the table had finally gone still, exhausted. The world outside was holding its breath, waiting for her to make a move. She stood up, her body stiff. She needed to move, to do something normal. She took a long, hot shower, letting the water try to rinse away the strange feeling that clung to her, a mix of stage sweat, adrenaline, and the dust of a past life shaken loose. She dressed in plain clothes, jeans and a soft sweater. They felt more real than the uniform ever had. When she finally picked up her phone, the screen was a mosaic of notifications, missed calls, texts, emails from unknown addresses. She scrolled past them, her heart beating a little faster. She found the text from the hotel's HR office again. "Your earliest convenience." It felt like a summons to a trial. She knew she couldn't hide. She had to go back, if only to close the door properly, to collect her last paycheck, to hand in her locker key, to look at the place, not as a prisoner, but as a visitor. The walk to the Grand Celeste felt different. The huge building didn't loom over her anymore. It was just a building. She went in not through the staff entrance, but through the grand front doors. The morning doorman, a different man from the night shift, didn't recognize her. He gave her a polite nod as she walked into the vast, silent lobby. The ballroom doors were shut, the scene of last night's explosion now just a cleaned-up room. She took the staff elevator down. The familiar smell of the basement corridor's lemon cleaner and stale coffee hit her. It felt like walking into a dream she'd already had. The manager of hotel services was waiting for her outside his office. He looked more nervous than she did. His eyes were wide, flitting around as if he expected Mr. Thorne to appear at any moment. "There you are," he said, his voice too loud in the quiet hall. Come in." His office was small and cluttered. He gestured for her to sit in a chair facing his desk. He didn't sit behind it. Instead, he perched on the edge, leaning towards her like he was sharing a secret. "Look," he began, rubbing his hands together, "about last night. It's caused quite a stir. Quite a stir. Mr. Thorne's office has been calling. Some reporters have called, too. We've told them nothing, of course. Privacy of staff is paramount." He was talking in circles. She just waited, her hands folded in her lap. "The thing is," he continued, "your position here, given the new circumstances, it's clearly not appropriate anymore." He forced a smile. "Mr. Thorne has asked me to extend a new offer, a role as an artist in residence. For the hotel, you'd perform in the lobby, at special events. A generous salary. Your own suite here, even. It's a fantastic opportunity." He said it all in a rush, like he was reciting lines he'd been told to say. He slid a single sheet of paper, a letter of intent, across the desk toward her. The hotel's logo was at the top. It looked official. It promised security, a stage, a solution to all her problems. She looked at the paper. She didn't pick it up. She imagined it, living in the hotel, playing beautiful music for guests as they checked in, being the cellist's own private, tame virtuoso. Mr. Thorne would introduce her to his friends. "Our discovery," he'd say. The story would always start with his command. "I made her play." "No," she said. The word was quiet, but final. The manager blinked. "I'm sorry. I'm here to collect my final wages and return my locker key," she said, her voice calm. "I'm resigning." He stared at her as if she'd just announced she could fly. "But the offer." "It's not my offer to accept," she said. She stood up. "Can we process the paperwork, please?" Flustered, the manager stumbled through the termination procedure. He printed out her final pay slip, his hands shaking. He took the locker key from her. As she was signing the last form, his office phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID, and his eyes went even wider. It's for you," he stammered, holding out the receiver. She hesitated, then took it. "Hello, it's Anton," said a warm, older voice on the other end. It was the retired conductor from the night before. "Forgive the intrusion. I called the hotel on a whim, hoping to find a way to reach you. I heard your manager's voice in the background." She was silent, unsure. "I was there last night," Anton continued. "I have been in concert halls for 60 years. What you did was not just playing. It was a homecoming." He paused. "I have a friend who runs a small conservatory, a good one, not a fancy one. They need a teacher for their most advanced students. It doesn't pay a fortune, but it pays honestly, and it would keep you near the piano, on your own terms. Would you allow me to give her your number?" This offer was different. It wasn't shiny. It was solid. It was about work, not spectacle. It was a door, not a gilded cage. She took a deep breath. "Yes," she said. "You can give her my number." She handed the phone back to the stunned manager. 15 minutes later, she was walking out of the Grand Celeste for the last time, an envelope with her final pay in her coat pocket. The sun was properly up now. When she got home, there was a message on her phone already, a gentle, no-nonsense voice from the conservatory director, asking if she might come in for an informal chat the next day. She called back and agreed. The rest of that day was long and strange. She cleaned her apartment, needing to use her hands. She tried to practice, but her mind was elsewhere. The buzz of the outside world was trying to get in. The arts columnist's story had been published. A few online music sites had picked it up. Mystery pianist stuns elite gala. Someone had filmed a few shaky seconds of the list on their phone, and the audio, tinny and distorted, was circulating. The buzz was growing into a murmur. Late in the afternoon, there was a knock on her door. Not a loud knock, a hesitant one. She opened it to find the young dishwasher from the hotel standing there, shifting from foot to foot. He looked terrified. "Hi," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry. I got your address from. Well, it doesn't matter. I had to come." She waited. He swallowed hard. "I play the guitar. Not like you, nothing like that. Just in my room. And after last night, watching you walk out, it made me think." He looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. "It made me think maybe the thing you love isn't supposed to be a secret, even if it's hard. So, thanks for that." He thrust a small, handmade card into her hand, then turned and almost ran down the stairs. She closed the door and looked at the card. On the front was a rough drawing of a piano. Inside, it just said, "Thank you for the fire." She held the card for a long time. That was it. That was the answer. It wasn't about fame or revenge or even justice. It was about the fire, not letting it go out. And maybe, just maybe, letting it warm someone else. The meeting at the conservatory the next day was in a small, sunlit office full of books and sheet music. The director was a sharp-eyed woman who spoke about music with a quiet passion. She didn't ask about the gala. She asked about teaching, about what pieces inspired frustration and joy, about the relationship between technique and heart. "The students are talented," the director said, "but they are afraid of mistakes, of the future, of not being good enough. Can you teach them how to be brave?" She thought of the walk to the piano, the choice between a sigh and a war. "I can try," she said. She got the job. It was part-time, to start. It would pay her rent, but not much more. It was perfect. Weeks passed. The buzz from the gala event slowly died down, chased away by newer stories. She started teaching. It was terrifying and wonderful. Her students, bright and anxious, had no idea who she was. To them, she was just the new teacher with quiet eyes and hands that could demonstrate anything. She found she was good at it. She liked seeing the moment a student pushed through a difficult passage, not with perfection, but with understanding. One evening, after her last student had left, the director found her in the small practice room where she taught. "There's a community hall," the director said casually. "They have a decent piano. They do a weekly concert series. Local players, students, anyone. The pay is a shared pot from the coffee fund. I told them you might be interested in playing something. No pressure, just if you wanted to." She thought about it. A hall, a decent piano. No commands, no glittering crowd. Just people who came for the music. "Okay," she said. The night of the community concert, she felt nervous in a way she hadn't at the gala. This was a choice. She wore a simple dark dress, not a uniform. The hall was small and warm, filled with folding chairs. About 40 people were there, students, older folks, parents with fidgety children. The air smelled of coffee and damp coats. When it was her turn, the director simply said, "Our new piano teacher would like to play for you." She walked to the piano. It was an old grand, well cared for. She sat down. She didn't play Chopin or Liszt. She played a piece by a composer she loved, one who wrote music that was both complex and deeply kind. She played it not as a weapon or a funeral, but as a gift. She played it for the joy of the sound, for the people in the quiet room, for the student who had drawn her a card, for herself. When she finished, the applause was warm and real. A few people came up to thank her. One older man said the piece had reminded him of his mother. A young girl asked how long she had practiced. She walked home through the quiet streets, the cold air fresh on her face. The